I'll gonna give my spiel again in just a second, and then we'll get started. Looks like we've already got about 25 people here, so welcome. Obviously, people are curious and want to talk about what we're learning from these election results and what they mean for our work. I know, again, like, because we kind of handpicked the awesome folks here, I know that everyone here has like a long-term view and knows that like elections influence our work, but are not the be-all and end-all of our work, and that the battle always continues. And so, I think that's a big part of why we wanted to gather, even though we don't necessarily know the exact kind of outcome or control of Congress situation. We still have, some data and information that is important to all of us as we do the constant work of assessing and reassessing what we're doing and how to have the most impact for the most people. So that's why we wanted to bring folks in. And we're coming up on 4:34, so I think that is enough for the customary Zoom grace period. So we will officially kick off our happy hour. I will take a sip of my local Boston beer. And I'm gonna, rather than kind of, yes, cheers to everyone, welcome. We made it, we're here. It's still stressful, extremely stressful. I heard NPR like kept touting this study that's like, people sleep less and drink more during election season. And I was like, did we need a study to tell us that? But here we are. And rather than kind of go down the list and name all of our panelists and then have them name all of themselves again, I'm gonna just kind of play game show host here and kick it around to different folks who we've invited and invite them to introduce themselves and give us like your one headline takeaway of like how you're feeling, what you're thinking coming out of where we are in this moment. And don't worry, I will come back to you with like leading questions about the awesome work that you all are doing. But for now, just who you are, how your work relates to all of this, and kind of your top line takeaway or what you're thinking, assessing coming out of these initial results that we're seeing from the U.S. midterms. So I'm going to kick it first to Ernesto Falcon from EFF, Electronic Frontier Foundation, longtime buddy of Fight for the Future and all around badass expert in the telecom and tech space. Yeah, Ernesto, tell us, I don't know, probably everyone here has heard of EFF, but first give us that and then tell us what your top line is, and then I'll let you kick it to someone else.
Yeah, certainly. So the Electronic Frontier Foundation, the EFF, is a civil liberties law firm that works in digital privacy and digital speech issues. I do the policy work for the EFF at the state level as well as in Washington, D.C. on the federal side. And I think the big takeaway I have from this election is the issues of privacy were galvanized, particularly when it comes to reproductive privacy, in a way that has created new salience and new opportunities to really advance protections for people when in response on the momentum that I think was built. And I think that's something that is of high interest for an organization that works on privacy issues writ large. And I think there's a lot of thoughts about how to push back on the erosion of privacy that has happened this year. I'll go ahead and kick it off because I think we have a lot of things we're going to talk through. I'm going to kick it off to Christine.
Hi, Christine Bannan. I lead U.S. public policy for Proton. We're a privacy technology company. Are probably most known for Proton Mail. We're the largest end-to-end encrypted email service and also offer VPN calendar drive. And we've gotten really involved with the antitrust legislation, the American Innovation and Choice Online Act and the Open App Markets Act, because of self-preferencing practices from Google and Apple that we've experienced as we've been growing the company and trying to make privacy tools, encryption tools more accessible to people around the world. And we see privacy and competition as deeply connected, which is why we've been so outspoken on these issues. And we're really trying to stay optimistic regardless of election results. So should I just kick to the next person, Evan? Yeah, okay. Brandon?
Hey, my name is Brandon, and I'm an organizer at MediaJustice. And at MediaJustice, we work on basically everything related to media and technology through the intersectional lens of economic, racial, and gender justice. My work focuses primarily on the internet and all things internet. And if I had to give you one headline, this isn't maybe the hopeful headline that folks want, but it's a little bit of more of the same. You know, I think that wherever this goes with this Congress, you know, there was never a progressive majority during this administration. And so it was really difficult at the federal level to get kind of progressive priorities passed. And I think it's going to continue to be that. And that doesn't mean that there's not victories to be had, especially in the internet space. I think we have a lot of opportunities that have already been created. But I think that one lesson from that is just how important the local work is going to be in making sure that communities are organizing for what they need. And I will pass it to Kate.
Thanks so much. So I'm Kate. I'm with Reframe Health and Justice, and we work a lot in the space of harm reduction, especially for sex workers and drug users. And my background is organizing with sex workers who predominantly engage in some way, shape, or form online, and do national advocacy around sex workers' rights, anti-trafficking, as well as work with local sex worker organizations to build their ability to engage in advocacy on the local level. And kind of similar to Brandon, that was a perfect tee up. You know, I think watching the midterms was, a lot of the same. And especially looking at the way that, you know, we always tend to go centrist, and how much that is continuing to fail us, I think, is a big takeaway. And I think the other is that we gained 2 Democratic governors. And I think that that is really important. And while we think about these things federally and we think about them nationally, the interaction between the state and the federal level is something that I think we need to take really seriously as we're moving forward, especially as we're looking at very radically different states as they're being positioned politically. Super excited to be here, and thank you so much. And I'm going to hand it over to Jenny.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks for having me. Evan, I love the idea of you as the game show host. So looking forward to that. I'm Jenny Olson. I'm the Senior Director of the Social Media Safety Program at GLAAD, the National LGBT Media Advocacy Organization. I lead our platform accountability work. I like to say it's my job to harass the platforms. I can say a little bit more about some of that work down the line, but it's funny, when you invited me to be part of this, I thought, ooh, I just want to hear what you have to say. And like, I feel like I'm like, what is my take? I'm not sure what my take is, because I've been so busy dealing with all of the day's Twitter mishigas, and which is, you know, I'm sure true for many of us. So yeah, I'm in many ways just excited to hear from you, Evan, and everyone else. Let's see, I'll hand it off to Mariah.
Hi, I'm Mariah, she, her. I'm the Director of Research and Advocacy with the Sex Workers Project of the Urban Justice Center. Fittingly, I'm getting over a cold, so I apologize, my voice is not its best and my brain is certainly not its best, but I've been tracking everything. So the work that we do at the Sex Workers Project, we work both federally, so I coordinate a lot with Kate actually on federal policy that impacts people who trade sex, which includes sex workers, people who've experienced trafficking, and everyone in between. But also we have a team of lawyers and DOJ accredited representatives in New York who represent people in immigration proceedings. So we focus a lot on what's happening in New York, and also where I'm based in DC. And then we have our managing director in New Orleans in Louisiana. So we tend to focus on local and state policy wherever we have staff. So I can provide some insights into kind of what has happened on the local level there. In New York, it was interesting, both in terms of congressional House races, which I'm sure a lot of people looked at as kind of like an outlier in terms of it being a generally blue state, but a lot of seats got flipped red and some very important seats got flipped red. But also in terms of state elections, there were seats that were lost from Democrats, but also it kind of creates potentially an opportunity, which we can get into more through this conversation. We've got some bills that are going to be reintroduced in the upcoming legislative session. One is a full decriminalization bill for sex work. And it's been it's really been harmed some ways by sort of centrist Democrats that lost their elections, actually. So we see it as perhaps an opportunity to work with some of the more progressive people that did actually hold on to their seats in the state legislature. Democrats maintain control in the state legislature overall, even though they lost some seats. And also Governor Hochul maintained her position as governor, and she's a Democrat. So we see that there's still a lot of opportunity there. We've also been following the local New York City policies and elections. So some interesting charter amendments were passed. And then down in DC where I am, some good, some bad, kind of like a mixture. Some folks that are very centrist Democrats. It's always going to be a majority Democrat city, I mean, generally speaking. So gains in that way or maintain the position there. And then there's some interesting policies that were passed, a ballot initiative passed to increase the tipped servers and the minimum wage for them. So yeah, some interesting stuff that's happening at the local level as well. And I will pass it to who hasn't gone yet. Eric.
Hi, thank you so much, Mariah, and thank you to Evan and Fight for the Future for putting this together. Really excited to be here. I work for Hamla, the Arab Center for the Advancement of Social Media, and we are a Palestinian digital rights organization that works to create a free, fair, and safe digital space for all Palestinians. We're a Palestinian founded, led, and based organization with the vast majority of our organization based in Palestine. I myself am not Palestinian, but I am our proud sole US-based worker, and I am our national organizer here in the United States. And to give a quick idea of what we do, we currently have 2 US-centric campaigns against Meta, the social media conglomerate that is Meta Let Palestine Speak, that is aimed at ending the silencing and censoring of Palestinian voices and narratives on social media. Which I'd love to talk more about that, as well as PayPal for Palestine, which is pleading with PayPal to open up and provide services to Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, which they currently do not, although they do provide services throughout the state of Israel, including to Israeli citizens that live in the illegal settlements in the West Bank. And happy to get into any of those sorts of things. But my main takeaways, I think, from the elections are, first and foremost, that right now we're living in a moment where it is more politically feasible to be explicitly pro-Palestinian for US politicians than it's ever been before. And there's a number of metrics that show that that's true. So we think that that is really a great development in the US political landscape. And also, I think it's really interesting and important when we're talking about digital rights to also note that the day before the midterm elections, Meta announced that they're going to lay off 11,000 people. And this is happening right after Elon Musk took over Twitter and has said that he is going to be also laying off a substantial amount of their employee workforce. So thinking about what the implications of that for digital rights, and specifically for the digital rights of the most marginalized populations in the same conversation as what a shifting US political landscape means, I think is really important. And I will then pass it off to Sawyeh.
Thank you, Eric. I'm Sawyeh Maghsoodloo. I use she, her pronouns. I work for Planned Parenthood at the national office, and I'm the Associate Director of Advocacy Research. In off years, what that means is I monitor the anti-abortion movement and what all those extreme organizations are doing in order to stop abortion access in the United States. And on election years, currently, I do political research. So if you heard any anti-abortion candidate quote, if you heard Dr. Oz's extreme quotes or Doug Mastriano's extreme quotes, I promise you I have those memorized, because I'm helping to monitor what they're doing and make sure that we're helping the public know what exactly these candidates plan to do if they're elected. Luckily, both of those men I just named did not win. I would like to say thanks to a lot of our work and the millions and millions of dollars that we spent on those races. But I would say that my main takeaway my main take, to keep it brief, is just this Vanity Fair headline that I'm looking at in one of my many tabs open. That the headline is literally, "The midterms prove abortion can galvanize voters." And that's one of dozens and dozens. I think our comms department is very busy gathering clips today because it's mentioned all over the front page of so many things, which we could talk about later. But I think if this midterm was about holding power, as midterms are really, frankly, we were not expecting or aiming even realistically to gain power in this midterm election. It's only happened twice ever in the history of the United States, and that's both times have been right after the US has not just gone to war, but been attacked on our own soil, World War II. Forgetting the second one, it'll come back to me later, but I think we held power. I think we more than held power. I feel really proud of what we did in this midterm. I think that it can be seen, especially in the 5 ballot initiatives where abortion was literally on the ballot and we won all 5. And I think that's a testament to how people are angry when women and people who can become pregnant, have their rights taken away from them, they vote. And I think that shocked a lot of people in a way that it shouldn't. I know that I was last, so I'll kick it back to you, Evan.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sawyeh, and all of you. Thank you. It's really, I know, again, like we kind of handpicked all the people here, so I know all of the work that you all are doing, but it's still just like always like humbling and inspiring to kind of like remember that like my little piece is here, and that there are badass people doing their work on the other pieces elsewhere. I'll kind of quickly give my like, sort of view of how I'm seeing the results and how they impact some of our work. And then I'm going to start, kind of popcorning questions at some of you all. And we do have some questions in the chat too, which are perfect and ones that I am looking forward to getting to. So if you have a question in the chat, Sammy and Dali, we're definitely going to get to your questions. We have a question about the Earn Act, and we have a question around both surveillance and censorship that trans people face online. So we will definitely cover those. So quickly, I'll just say I really agree with what Brandon and Kate and others said here, that like there's good stuff that we can extrapolate from these results and what they mean for what voters are thinking, and what they may mean for kind of the longer view of electoral politics. But in the short term, it really does feel like whether Republicans take the House with, a modest number of seats or a tiny number of seats, which seems like the question at the moment, and whether Republicans take the Senate by a seat or not, it seems like the other two questions. But when I actually game out either of those scenarios, it almost doesn't matter for a lot of the tech policy legislative fights that we are tracking. It of course matters for so many other things, but when I kind of do my cynical, ruthless analysis of how does this impact some of the legislative fights that we're considering, it feels like a lot more of the same. Congress has been essentially non-functional and deadlocked around both good things and a lot of bad things for the last several years. And my impression is that like that seems likely to continue for the foreseeable future. To be really blunt, my impression is that like a lot of the conversations around tech policy that have been extremely frustrating are likely to get slightly more frustrating, but not radically change in terms of what is likely to pass or move, and also kind of what the threats are. But I will say one exception, which is that one thing I'm really concerned about in a divided Congress is when there's this tremendous pressure for Democrats and Republicans to kind of find common ground on a tech issue. And we sort of know that the common ground between Democrats and Republicans on most tech issues is kind of an unholy alliance of authoritarian, regressive ideas, things like the Earn Act, things like bills that are framed as protecting children's safety, but actually subject children and others to invasive surveillance, undermine their safety and security, and lead to widespread removal of helpful content, particularly for LGBTQ folks. And we can get into more of some of those specifics there. But what I really worry about is with Republicans controlling the House, if that happens, we know they're going to kind of trot out a series of bills that are framed as, stopping censorship of conservatives, that take aim at Section 230 specifically, and that there will then be this big pressure on Democrats of like, well, where can we find common ground? And then I worry that we end up back with something like the Earn It Act or a Section 230 carve-out bill that's around opioids or something else that sort of seems non-controversial and bipartisan, but actually leads to, a tremendous harm, particularly to marginalized communities. So I'll share that that's kind of my like ruthless take of just like, what does this mean for the types of tech bills that we're looking at? Obviously, it has broad implications, as all of our other panelists just shared. But we did have a specific question about the Earn It Act. And I know that there's a number of folks here that have worked on that. So I thought, Kate, can I put you on the spot to just quickly, A, just give attendees a summary of what the Earn It Act is, and B, give a quick update on how you view, and I think let's not keep it just to the Earn It Act, but the Earn It Act and similar types of legislation. What are you worried about and or optimistic about given the potential change in the makeup of Congress?
Sure, and I'm going to keep the background just as narrow as possible. So Section 230 of the Communications and Decency Act, what it does is it says that there's content platforms and there's content makers. What content makers post on content platforms are not civilly responsible for. They still can face criminal implications, but it's civil. It's the lawsuits that are that platforms are protected by or protected from because of Section 230. About 4 and change years ago, the first kind of carve out was created for those civil protections known as Sesta Fosta. It did some other things too, but we're going to focus on the 230 part. And what it did was say in very broad, very general terms that if there were, if a website was facilitating trafficking and didn't really define facilitation, and it wasn't necessarily clear what that meant, it didn't specify how much they knew about the situation, then they were going to be civilly liable. We've spent the last 4 and change years using the courts to try to figure out what that means because it was so poorly written when it went into place. But what it did was really create a chilling effect where platforms said, I'm not going to be the guinea pig for these lawsuits, because it also expanded who could sue. So I don't have a $2 million litigation budget. I'm going to make a guess at what you're going to interpret as facilitating trafficking. And really because of congressional discussion, because of the media, because of who they assumed were going to sue them, that really was anything that they interpreted as related to the sex industry for a lot of websites. And so that was kind of the first time we saw that approach where they created these carve outs to civil litigation to try to encourage websites to make decisions. What the Earn It Act does is go in and say, all right, we loved that approach. And you know what we should do? We should expand it. And we should even be less clear and more expansive about the carve out that we're creating. And the problem was when websites went in to do that, it really disproportionately impacts folks that need those sites. So because we're talking about the sex industry and anyone profiled around the sex industry, we're talking about losing places where sex workers could contact clients, find community, connect with each other, share harm reduction information, share basic safety and health information. All of that was shuttered. And so what the Earn It Act does is go in and say, we want to take the same approach, even though we've not necessarily rigorously studied the impact on platforms, on communities, on marginalized people. We like the idea and we really like the press releases we got out of it. So what the Earn It Act does is take that same tactic and broaden it to what's referred to as child sexual abuse material, and it's explicit material of minors. And while that does sound incredibly narrow, the problem is that's not how it's interpreted. And even in the legislation, it is very unclear how that's defined. And so not only does it say, you know what, we're going to use the federal definition of this, which is pretty clear. We're also going to say that any state law that references or is in service to this is going to count. So when you're thinking about explicit material and we're thinking about how that's being discussed, how child abuse is being discussed now, think about trans kids, think about trans healthcare, think about abortion access for minors, which is already incredibly difficult. Think about the way that we're talking about child abuse, not the way that the law is defining child abuse, because that's what becomes interpreted by platforms. So that's kind of the backstory of the Earn It Act. It was introduced by the same person that introduced SESTA, and takes the same tactic and just broadens it even further to really talk about anything related to the sexuality of minors as defined by the most Republican, most conservative states in the country. So it's been introduced, and like, as we know, when a bill is introduced, if it doesn't pass, it dies and it has to be reintroduced. So now I believe this is going to be the third reintroduction in the next congressional session of the Earn It Act. And while I would love to be able to kind of successfully forecast it and say, you know, this is what's happening, we do know that it is going to be reintroduced. We do know that Senator Blumenthal, who's a Democrat from Connecticut, is still going around and really trying to sell and build a lot of support for this bill, and especially going to very religious right organizations, anti-LGBTQ organizations to do this and to build traction for the Earn It Act. And there's been a lot of mixed reception, and I'd love to know kind of what others are thinking about this, but there has been mixed reception around this in a couple of different ways. One of the most impactful things is pointing out just how incredibly broad this bill is in terms of who it would necessarily affect, because don't think about the federal law. Think about the most conservative states' approach to how they define child abuse, because that's what's going to be on the forefront of platforms' minds when they're thinking about who's going to sue them and for what. And that's really gotten a lot of traction with staffers and with Congress members about saying, you know, we have seen on the ground the impact of FOSTA-SESTA. How much do you want this to impact marginalized people who are going to be the targets of these lawsuits and these bills? And so that's gained a lot of traction and really caused a lot of pause on the Hill. On the other side, really thinking about carve-outs to 230, I think still does give a lot of pause, especially when we're talking about younger members of Congress. And, you know, when we're talking about Congress members that have been around for a very long time, that have very well entrenched staffers versus Congress members who are newer, who might have younger staffers, who are from fields that are not someone else's congressional office, that actually really does make a difference on the ground. And the way that FOSTA-SESTA has played out, and then looking at the way that the Earn It Act is going to play out, I think is the other thing that is really giving a lot of folks on the Hill pause about what's going to happen. So while it will be introduced, I really do think that there's a lot more hesitation around this bill in particular because of what happened with FOSTA-SESTA, and because it's such a replication of that bill, and that's something that's unique to Earn It that is not true about many of the other tech bills. And so there's something that staffers can point to and say, like, this looked like a disaster, and that's really helpful. So, you know, that's kind of my prediction on it. It's definitely going to be introduced, and maybe it's going to turn into a messaging bill, but I am hopeful that it's not going to move as fast or as aggressively as I think it would have probably in the first time it was introduced.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kate. And Mariah, in a second, maybe I'll kick it to you and to talk about the Safe Sex Workers Study Act, which is sort of, you know, perhaps like the counter to let's just move Earn It, like, hey, let's study what we did last time before we do other stuff again. But before we go there, I did just want to, you know, keep it focused in the now, right? And in terms of, you know, one of the things I'm thinking a lot about coming out of the election is, you know, we're predicting, as Kate just was, like what's going to come in the next Congress. But I think one thing we know for sure is, since things are not looking like they're going to get significantly better for thoughtful, good, human rights centric tech policy in the next 2 years, that gives us a really narrow window to try to get a few important things done now in this session between now and the end of the election. It has an unfortunate name that I will not say on this call, but the duck session that we need to work on. And to that end, Christine, I was wondering if I could put you on the spot, because I think, you know, there's, you know, probably a lot of different views on this call around the scale and harm and power of big tech companies like Facebook, Google, Apple, Amazon, what their role is in our society. Lots of different groups here are engaged in campaigns pressuring those companies to do better. But there's also kind of, I think, this underlying reality of the monopoly power of the largest companies and how that is sort of at the root of many of their other harms and abuses. And that's one of the few areas where we actually have like good legislation that has moved pretty far, that's bipartisan, which is so rare, and where we do have kind of a perhaps once in a lifetime opportunity to move it. But obviously time is really running out, not to be too grim about it, but it really doesn't look likely that we'll have a lot of opportunity to move this in the next Congress. And so could you talk a little bit about the bills that I'm talking about that obviously you can explain, and what our kind of urgent opportunity around them is. And then just to kind of put other folks on deck, maybe after that, we'll come back to Mariah on Safe Sex Worker Study Act. Brandon, then I was hoping you could talk about FCC maybe, because I think that's relevant. All right, so Christine, please.
Sure. So this antitrust legislation, I think, is quite different politically than some of the other legislative priorities represented here. And because it's been bipartisan from the beginning, and so there's the American Innovation and Choice Online Act and the Open App Markets Act. They apply to the biggest tech companies. So Google, Apple, Amazon, Meta, and Microsoft, maybe. And the goal of them is to allow for small businesses, both tech startups like us, but also like Amazon third-party sellers, businesses that advertise using Google and Meta to reach more users and to get past some of this self-preferencing tactics that the big tech companies use to suppress competition and keep their monopoly share of users online, which leads to a lot of privacy harms and speech harms, and just is bad for users overall. So politically, we anything is difficult to pass in Congress, and there's only a few weeks left in this session, but I think this is one of those few pieces of legislation that has built up this consensus over the past few years through investigations, through hearings, committee reports, and does have a chance, whether that's to be to get floor time on its own or to be included in some type of omnibus end of year package. But I'll say also, like, going into next Congress, I don't think all hope is lost with a House Republican majority, because of the platform they put out does include some language around antitrust and especially the app stores. I think it's unlikely that the Klobuchar-Grassley bill, the American Innovation and Choice Online Act, could pass a Republican majority in its full form, but there are some chances to get some of this fair competition legislation done, maybe in a more targeted way at the app stores. So we're keeping the momentum up. I mean, some of these legislative fights span across many Congresses until they're done. So I think that's the message now, is that we've come so far. I think 3 years ago, no one would have thought that U.S. Congress would be seriously this close to passing, regulating the big tech companies. So there's been it's a very broad big tech coalition, and there's still hope for this Congress and the next. So I'm still pretty positive, all things considered.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks, Christine. And yeah, I always remind myself, like, it took literal decades to overcome the corporate lobby and get basic protections in place around like big tobacco and car manufacturers and many other large, powerful, entrenched industries in the United States. So all things considered, I think we're doing a pretty darn good job in terms of making it as far as we have on some of these anti-monopoly fights in the tech industry. Speaking of anti-monopoly in the tech industry, I think there's been a kind of perhaps obsessive focus in the press around some of the companies we were just talking about, Facebook, Amazon, Google, and perhaps people forget about our true overlords, AT&T, Comcast, Verizon, et cetera. Brandon, can I kick it to you to talk a little bit about the longstanding work that MediaJustice has done holding those giants accountable, and how you view particularly the fight around the Federal Communications Commission, both in this pending lame duck session and what it means in a new Congress. And then Mariah, will go to you on Safe Sex Worker Study Act after that.
Yeah, I want to say I'm losing light. This is not a fake background. I'm actually outside. So my intention is not to set a mood that I'm here to tell scary stories, but I may be telling some scary stories. Yeah, I think what excitement to talk about the administrative state. So it may not seem that exciting, but of course, folks who are on this call, I'm sure, have been involved with the fight for net neutrality in Title II, and so are very familiar with the FCC and the important role that it plays. And we've had a deadlocked FCC, and that's not to say that this FCC has not done some good things. I think we have a really good chairperson at the FCC who's really committed to communities, but they can only get so much done in a deadlocked FCC. And when I said more of the same, I was really thinking about, this kind of false idea that there was some kind of majority in Congress to be able to get things done, because there's been an incredible nominee to the FCC, Gigi Son, who has been a nominee for over a year and has not been able to get a vote. And so, there are a lot of things that the FCC is working on right now that are going to be maybe not incredibly harmful, but are going to not be great because they're not able to do great work. And it's not that we're starting at just a balanced place, because we had the previous administration with the chairperson, Ajit Pai, who was essentially attacking any kind of program that was to help to get people connected to the internet, any kind of program that was trying to make it so that our real overlords, people talk about big tech and they don't often include big cable and big telecom, but I think they certainly should be included in that, or we just need to say big cable and big telecom more. It's not as exciting. And so, we have a lot of repair work that we need to do. Folks may have heard about the Affordable Connectivity Program or the Emergency Broadband Benefit. Those are new programs that happened because of the pandemic to help make sure that people could afford the internet, because the biggest barrier, the biggest thing that is causing the digital divide, other than these awful telecom companies that kind of operate like the mafia, is affordability. And so Lifeline for a long time was the only affordability program that existed for getting people connected to phone or internet. And it's not been sufficient, quite honestly. And then it was kind of tried, honestly, Ajit Pai was trying to kind of drown in a bathtub, And so we have an ongoing rulemaking process around what the future of Lifeline is going to look like. This Affordable Connectivity Program is an appropriated program that has limited funding. And so we don't know what this Congress is going to look like and if there's going to be a chance to get that extended. We also have this FCC that is working for the first time on digital discrimination rules. And we have a real opportunity to repair some harms that are not just like harms of these companies, but harms that go back for almost a century. And frankly, I think that this FCC is doing the best that they can, but the best that they can just may not be enough, honestly, with the deadlocked FCC. And so I think I was talking to a reporter last week and I said, we're going to end up with rules where they're going to be like, we can only call it digital discrimination if we've got a secret recording of Comcast CEO yelling we're not going to serve those racial slurs with the internet. That's not going to be sufficient. And all of the issues that people are going to be talking about here, whether or not it's access to reproductive justice, whether or not it's access to be able to privately get secure information or build community, the internet's necessary for all of those things. And there are a lot of people who don't have access to that, don't have access to community, won't have access to be able to find safe ways towards reproductive justice or trans healthcare. And so all of these issues, and we learned this during the pandemic, the internet is not a luxury. The internet is not just about getting on Facebook It's about everything. It's about going to your eviction hearing. It's about doing healthcare. It's about getting your education. And so I'm a little bit hopeful that maybe we can still get GG confirmed before the new Congress takes place. But if we don't, then I think the failure of this administration and their so-called majority in the Senate to actually get GG confirmed is going to lead to a complete failure of this administration's priorities around the internet. Now, and there's still some good things that can happen. I don't want to be totally bleak, but there's some really important things that are just going to be caught, not because there weren't laws that were passed to help us do good things, but because in the administrative state, this Congress can't confirm a nominee, and so they just won't have the ability to do things. Yeah.
Word. Yeah. Thanks, Brendan. And I mean, I think it's interesting just to remind folks too, because it's been a minute since we've talked about these fights, but all of this stuff connects together, right? If we're concerned about the behavior of entrenched tech companies like Meta and YouTube and Google, how much worse does the situation become if those companies can cut deals with Comcast and Verizon and AT&T to essentially solidify their existing monopoly power? And there's been a lot of discussion around, just how unsustainable it is to build our kind of digital homes on land owned by mercurial billionaires, especially in the last couple of days with Musk's takeover of Twitter. I know half the people in this call I'm already seeing popping up on Mastodon, and it's hard to imagine, kind of more nonprofit, more decentralized, more transparent models being able to succeed if, companies like Comcast and Verizon can, extract fees from them or block them outright. So I think it's just important to remind people why these fights matter, even as perhaps our collective attention has been focused elsewhere. So I'm going to kick it over to Mariah, because I think we're in a phase right now of talking about like, what can we do? What are some of the positive things we can advance? So getting GG Sohn confirmed to the FCC got to be a top priority in this session as soon as possible. I think there's also an ongoing bill that Mariah could talk about, which is the Safe Sex Workers Study Act. And then Sawyeh, after that, I was hoping to kick it over to you to just, again, I think we're talking about midterms right now, but at least for me, just the biggest seismic shift in how I'm viewing my priorities around tech policy is actually not the midterms themselves, but the overturning of Roe. And I want to make sure that we have time for you to talk explicitly about especially legislation that we expect to pass in the states, and particularly how it criminalizes not just abortion access, but speech, organizing, and fundraising around abortion. But want to make some space for you to explain some of that to us. So, and I think that's obviously also related, Mariah, to the work that you're going to talk about. So first to Mariah on Safe Sex Workers Study Act, and then to Sawyeh.
Thank you. So as Kate laid out, SESTA FOSTA was passed in April of 2018 and has had devastating effects on people who trade sex, but has also had really harmful effects on people who tend to be profiled as sex workers and people who disproportionately do sex work. So in particular, LGBTQ people, but especially trans women of color, and the disproportionate censorship of materials that they post online. So what we have been working on is a bill that was first introduced in 2019 during the previous Congress, and then was reintroduced this year on March 3rd, so 2022. It was International Sex Worker Rights Day. It's the Safe Sex Worker Study Act, and it was introduced by Senator Warren and House Representative Ro Khanna. So the bill itself is pretty simple in what it's asking, but is really necessary in this moment in particular. It would study the effects of SESTA FOSTA on people who trade sex. And it really puts sex workers at the front and center of the rationale for why we need this bill, which is unique and very historic. So we see it as an important bill. We want to see it get passed. It's a moment where we can get another, we've got a few more weeks where we can get some support for it, but also it's just really critical historically that there's a bill that is saying, these are the effects of this law. This is how it's harmed sex workers in particular, and it needs to be studied, and legislators need to stop making legislation based on assumptions around, what's going to work to curb trafficking, but actually have really harmful effects on other populations. They need to be legislating from a place of evidence and data. So the bill itself would allow legislators to actually get that evidence of what has happened with SESTA FOSTA. So instead of recreating that harm in a bill like the Earn It Act or some other type of law that looks to curb and create carve-outs of Section 230 and chill other types of speech, they would actually have the evidence of what happened the first time that they did that, how it harmed people who trade sex, how it harms people who are profiled as sex workers, and how it harms people who are experiencing trafficking in the sex trades. So right now, I think based on the outcomes in the Senate races and the fact that we still are unknown in Georgia, it's unlikely to get a lot more attention or support on the Senate side. But I think we have an opportunity during, and again, I won't say the name of it, but this duck session to get more support on the House side. So Kate and I have been having conversations with certain House offices around getting additional sponsorship to the bill in these next few weeks, and then hopefully getting some additional attention to the bill itself before the end of this Congress. Based on how everything is going, I think it is unlikely for it to pass, but for all the reasons that I outlined, it still has a lot of significance. And I think it's really important that folks who are on this call who care about these issues lend some extra support right now. If you don't know about the bill, I'm happy to provide the link to the bill text, but look through it, add your support, call your representatives. We're also putting together, what are the outcomes for the elections in terms of like, who are the current sponsors and who do we need to be looking to for reintroduction in the upcoming Congress. We've already heard interest from Ro Khanna's office around reintroduction for the next Congress. So we're hoping that that will be something that is possible. And we would be, asking for support from folks that are on this call once it is reintroduced. But yeah, so that's kind of like a really brief overview of the Safe Sex Workers Study Act, but happy to provide more details as folks might have questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Mariah. And, I think I dropped a link into the chat of an op-ed that I wrote for Wired with my colleague Leah Holland that kind of talks about some of what you were just addressing there in terms of potential harms of changes to 230 in a post-Roe environment. Ernesto, in a minute, I might kick it over to you to kind of talk about the landscape more broadly around this type of legislation. And I don't know specifically if you'd be willing to talk about Kids Online Safety Act, which is the other bill that I've heard may still move during the lame duck that I think raises some of these similar concerns and is worth talking about. But either way, I'll kick it over to you after Sawyeh. But Sawyeh, while we're kind of talking about, obviously we're talking about the tech side of this in terms of how when things are criminalized, it then impacts kind of internet regulation, writ large. And so that's kind of what Mariah and I are discussing. But can you, since you're tracking this so much more closely than probably many other folks here, just give us some insight, like I was saying, into, what already has passed at the state level that is really concerning to you, and what are you expecting, even with obviously the good news coming out of these ballot initiatives? What can we expect in the next couple of years, given the makeup of state houses, et cetera, in terms of criminalization of activities related to abortion?
Yeah, thank you. So it's important to remember that Roe, it made it a state fight. It made access to abortion a state fight because it didn't outright ban abortion at the federal level. As a reminder, it kicked it back to the states, as they like to say. So any state that wants to can now ban abortion, and many already have, as we've seen. We know that 1 in 3 women currently now live in a state that has banned abortion. And so, like I said, and like you wisely asked, it's very much a state fight. And because we're constrained by gerrymandering, by the filibuster, our strategy is going to be engaging on the state level, also in democracy reform to try to fix those things that I just mentioned. Side note, but some of the attacks that we're seeing are very much, like you said, about criminalization, just about our basic freedoms. We're seeing the anti-abortion side pass things like bans on crossing state lines to get an abortion. Crossing state lines is more than abortion. It's about police enforcing abortion bans. That is a very scary reality for authoritarianism, for criminalization, for the expansion of the carceral system, for any other issue that they want to keep their state free of in these red states. we're also seeing bans on, or proposed bans on, you can't advertise about abortion. So we can't even tell people that they can access abortion at our clinics. Even YouTube, for example, already rejects any of our ads that we try to put that say the word abortion. We have to keep them very vague, and vague doesn't help anybody. People are seeking healthcare information, and we are not able to give it to them. We're also seeing these bounty hunting provisions that I think are really, really scary. We saw it in Texas as the first example, which is that if you know that your neighbor had an abortion despite it being illegal in the state, you can literally tell on them and get paid for it. And we've seen other states try to copy that and try to pass similar bans. And like I was saying in the beginning, that's about way more than abortion. It's very much about abortion, not to erase it, but that kind of bounty hunting thing can be applied to you. You're setting a precedent. It can be applied to any issue and any cultural issue that they're desperately trying to repress. And so I also think another thing to mention is that's all the bad things that we can expect to be attempted and successful probably in a handful of states. But without Roe, one very thin silver lining is that the risk of doing proactive state level things like ballot initiatives, the risk is pretty small now, because in the past, if we tried to do a proactive ballot initiative to protect abortion in a state's constitution, if it fails, we're screwed. This is a happy hour thing, so I can swear a little bit, but like, we're screwed if it fails. But now without Roe, that risk equation is different, and so we tried it. I mean, we being the royal we, but as I mentioned in my intro, abortion was on the ballot in 5 states. In states like Kentucky and Montana, they protected abortion, and so bring it on. I mean, I think that. In terms of what our next strategies are, I think that we're going to see a lot of ballot initiatives in the next election. And we're feeling pretty optimistic about being able to protect abortion, at least in that way. I also want to mention state Supreme Court races, which affects, I think, many, if not all, the issues that we've mentioned today. A lot of those are elected. And so we tried to invest in as many as we could this election and saw some gains from that. But abortion is being challenged in the courts in most states, in a lot of states. Even when we do pass good bills, we can protect ourselves in advance by making sure that we invest in our state Supreme Court races too. I want to advocate for that among this group. I think that's it.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much for that, Sawyeh. That's really helpful. And actually, before I kick it to you, Ernesto, Jenny, I'm wondering if you could do kind of a similar just survey, because I think this might actually cue you up as well a little bit, Ernesto, on the wave of anti-trans legislation that I know we've been facing. And it doesn't have to be super in the weeds, but if you could give us an overview of kind of the parallel of what we're seeing in terms of criminalization of healthcare for trans folks, healthcare for trans kids, speech about those issues, and how what your concerns are as that relates to kind of what we're talking about here in terms of tech policy.
Thanks, Evan. Yeah, I mean, briefly, it's so hard to keep track. I mean, there's been more than 250 anti-LGBT bills this past year nationally, and more than 100 of them anti-trans bills. There are just so many heinous things and so many parallels to anti-abortion stuff. And when we think of it as this is about healthcare, it really drives home how wrong it is that it is such attacks, such specific, ostensibly the bills are about protecting children. Obviously we know that it's not about protecting children, it's about constraining people's rights and dignity. And I just want to point out one thing, a proposed bill from yesterday from Tennessee that is particularly like insane. The attempting to constrain cross-dressing, and these, but it is a really great example of these kind of things of like the ramifications are so massive in terms of like, oh, and you're trying to understand like, wait, what's going on here? What are the implications? Oh, no, drag, no cross-dressing, no, and like that literally this could end up being like that, like pride parades are illegal, I mean, the implications are obviously just unbelievable. Anyway, that's just one small example. I did want to make volunteer a suggestion for the duck issue, which is same duck.
Same duck.
Same duck in the sense that part of it is that like the duck, it's the same duck. It's like the old duck. I don't know. Anyway, that's my
Meet the new duck, same as the old duck. Yeah. I like it, Jenny. Thank you. So yeah, I mean, and I think that bill is actually a harrowing example, right? So here's an attempt to criminalize expression, a certain type of expression being how you dress. I think there was another bill that was specifically trying to criminalize drag shows during daytime hours, which is hilarious to me. But Ernesto, to kick it to you, I mean, in this environment where we have states that are criminalizing speech about LGBT issues, speech about reproductive health and justice, where we could easily imagine a state criminalizing speech about vaccines or any number of other issues. How do you and EFF view kind of the ongoing fights around content regulation, but also, and I mentioned Kids Online Safety Act specifically, if we're able to address it, but then also around the privacy dynamics of this, right? All of these laws and everything that Sawyeh just described, especially in terms of tracking people across state lines, et cetera, is obviously going to be enforced through electronic surveillance, primarily through warrants, through location data, through accessing people's online communications. So can you talk us through a little bit of the landscape of both the speech and surveillance implications of the moment that we're in?
Yeah, I would say, so the EFF's been around for a little over 30 years, and the general philosophy has been that technology should be a force of empowerment, never something that takes rights and liberties away from people. And I think we're really at a major deciding point in a number of areas in this country about how should technology be used, and namely, there's an awful lot of effort to, I would say, suppress liberty under the premise of protection or the premise of preventing a quote unquote harm that one group of people have a perception of what they think is harmful, but another group of people see no harm in it. And I think there's a real need to organize people to empower folks who just want to be left alone. I mean, left to their own life, their own choices, their own decisions. And the Kids Online Safety Act is a great example of this, of the idea that there's some sort of uniform one vision of what the perfect structure of family and self is, and if you deviate from that, that must be a harm that we must rectify with some sort of punishment or censorship or some restraints. The Kids Online Safety Act basically puts a responsibility on internet platforms to monitor, kind of a broad range of activities that are deemed harmful. How those are deemed harmful is left up to a number of different types of enforcers, the most worrisome of them being kind of state attorney generals. And we're talking quite a lot right here of there's an active effort to really harm disempowered communities under the premise that we're somehow protecting the kids or something to that effect. And this bill that we've been fighting in Congress, and it's a bipartisan bill, right? And sometimes the worst ideas are bipartisan. It is premised on the idea of protecting children by requiring a lot of responsibilities to censor and block and take down content. And if you fail to do those things, liability will then ensue. As the measurement of pain that would force companies to over restrict what's available on the internet and what people can access. And I think what's notably interesting on this one on the Kids Online Safety Act is the age they would consider children is 16 and down. I think most remember what we were like at 16. I don't think we felt like a child, at that point. There is this transitioning point where we are no longer children, we are just young adults, and it's not exactly when you hit 18. Yeah, I think that's kind of the nature of the fight right now. I mean, there's a lot of people who simply want to be, and this motivates a lot of the competition effort of the FF. We want a world where people can decide, if I don't like this community or this moderator of my content, Elon Musk takes over Twitter, there should be a very easy world where you can switch to another platform, another area that's more suitable to your community needs, that you feel more inclusive and included as a community you go to. I think Reddit does a miniature version of this within its own kind of subreddit structure, if folks are familiar with them. But there's no reason the internet in general is not like that, absent the fact that there's an awful lot of concentration within a small number of hands on the tools we use to communicate on the internet today. And the always and historically, the counter to very large concentration of private power has been law and regulation and antitrust. So, we're supportive of a lot of the antitrust efforts that are happening now. I think even if they were not to pass this year, the general public, I think, is wary of how much power a small number of corporations have over just their ability to thrive and communicate online and share culture and ideas, and the few hands that control our abilities to do that.
Word, yeah, thanks, Ernesto. Just to follow up on the second piece of that, can you talk a little bit about encryption and, both fears and, just importance of securing people's communications, given everything that you just described?
Yeah, I think the big takeaway from the midterms and, thanks to groups like Planned Parenthood and others that demonstrated that reproductive privacy is actually a winner in some of the most conservative places in the country. It is emboldened folks who are too scared to take those issues on head on. And I think, and for a lot of bad reasons, right? A lot of times there's folks in the kind of the polling place or in the kind of the DC inside place like, oh, that's too controversial. We should just avoid ruffling too many feathers. And I think that has, in the encryption space, I think that has tended to favor the argument against encryption, which has been, well, crimes are happening online, such as the distribution of child pornography, and therefore we shouldn't have private communications because private communications allow crimes to happen. And it's such a deceptive way to avoid the purpose of private communications, which is to secure your information when you share it online, your financial health data, all the things we do, our whole lives now are online. You want that pretty locked down for your own personal security. And I think the issue of reproductive privacy and the number of state criminal laws that are heinous on their face because they were passed 100 years ago in a world that doesn't exist anymore, but now are in effect criminalizing abortion. Suddenly, a number of policymakers are willing to, I think, take on and admit that, yeah, I would like things that would stifle the ability of heinous criminal laws from being enforceable, and whatever means of providing private communications that would allow that type of protection is okay with me. I think that's a big breakthrough moment because I think traditionally kind of the law and order and the, you're not in favor of criminals, quote unquote, type of attacks have been successful against trying to, add some humanity and compassion to our policies, especially in the tech space.
Word, yeah, and I'll just highlight Fight for the Future is running a campaign at makedmssafe.com which is focused not on the regulatory aspects of this, but just direct pressure on the companies. You know, a lot of companies have started moving toward offering end-to-end encryption more regularly. Meta, for whatever it's worth, is actually moving in this direction perhaps more quickly than some of the other large companies. And, you know, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Meta is good for the world, but it is good for the world if we can pressure Meta to speed up their process of flipping the switch and making all Facebook messages end-to-end encrypted by default. You know, that instantaneously protects hundreds of millions of people, not just from being criminalized for seeking an abortion, but you know, I always think about like teenagers who are dealing weed and like random stuff who are just being over criminalized, and who end-to-end encryption would protect and start cutting off some of this surveillance-driven prison pipeline that we know is you know, over criminalizing particularly Black and brown communities in the United States. So I think it's just, you know, sometimes these tech issues are framed as like lofty and over there. You know, these are like issues that directly impact you know, particularly the most vulnerable members of our society every single day. And on that front, you know, I think we can get a little navel gazing here in the US when we look at US politics. And that's why, you know, perhaps we should have, you know, even more, you know, folks representing kind of international fights here. But going back to you, Eric, you know, we've been talking a lot about how, you know, shifts in politics in the US are kind of criminalizing more and more speech. But the reality, you know, and I think content moderation discussions in the US have largely, you know, been kind of co-opted by like the Ted Cruz's of the world, who are like, I am the true defender of free speech. And then, you know, to be a little blunt, frankly, also, you know, I think perhaps a focus on, you know, getting platforms to remove more content more quickly being kind of the like summary of how a lot of civil society groups in the US are approaching content moderation. Can you talk to us a little bit about like what the experience is for Palestinians who have experienced kind of the wrong side of content moderation so systematically and disproportionately for so many years, and what you would ask organizers in the US to inject into these conversations around content moderation so that we can ensure that we're not making policies that leave out the people who've actually been most impacted by some of these issues.
Yeah, that's such a great question, Evan. Thank you for that question. And you're right to kind of bring up this tension that a lot of the work that we do is around ensuring that Palestinian content and Palestinian narratives are able to stay up online so that people can see them. And oftentimes when we're in civil society space that's focused on digital rights in the digital world, it's around ensuring that really harmful content is taken down. And that work is obviously very important for a variety of reasons. But let me just give you an example of something that happened a little over a year ago now. Al-Aqsa Mosque is in Jerusalem. It is considered the third holiest site in the Muslim world. And it is a very, very, very important place for Palestinians. And in 2021, during the May uprisings and military aggression that were taking place because the state of Israel was forcibly evicting Palestinian families rather, from their homes in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of East Jerusalem, Al-Aqsa was immediately taken down if it was referenced in any sort of content on Meta's platforms, because Meta made the mistake that Al-Aqsa was directly connected to Al-Aqsa Brigade, which is a militarized faction of a political wing of Palestinian resistance. And so that meant that not only Palestinians, but the entire Arabic-speaking and Muslim world could not reference the third holiest site in the Muslim world without that content being taken down. And we also have seen a wave of Palestinians using social media very effectively to document human rights violations being perpetrated by the Israeli occupying forces that has really led to what we believe a major shift in global perceptions around what is happening in Israel and Palestine, because for so long, the mainstream media has really failed the Palestinian people by giving a very Israeli-focused perspective of what is happening, and we see more and more that folks are understanding exactly what the Palestinian experience is. And so as that has taken place, Palestinians will be live streaming the human rights violations of Israeli soldiers, and their content is immediately taken down and has been labeled against community standards. And so this led to Meta's oversight board, what we often refer to kind of as the Supreme Court of social media, to make a recommendation that Meta institute a independent review of Hebrew and Arabic content on their platforms in the Israel and Palestine context specific to the May 2021 uprisings. So it had a very, very, very small scope, but that independent review did happen by BSR, Business for Social Responsibility, the global nonprofit, and that independent review came out and was published in September 22nd. Sorry, I'm falling over my words here. And it showed what Hamla and what civil society has been saying for many, many years, that Meta's practices and business policies have a bias against Palestinians, and they over-moderate Palestinian and Arabic content, and they under-moderate Hebrew content, and that this leads to adverse human rights implications. And we don't think that it's kind of any incident that there was an uptick in over-moderation of Palestinian content when the Palestinian content started leading to a more globally pro-Palestinian world perspective. And so we have, as a response to this report, we have launched with our partners, Fight for the Future being one of them, the Meta Let Palestine Speak campaign. And the report from BSR is not our own words. It's not exactly aligned with what we have been saying, but we think it is very good. And we're very happy with the report. We think it's a step in the right direction. BSR issued a number of recommendations, and the main ask and demand of our campaign is that Meta issue a statement that gives a detailed plan for implementation of all of these recommendations within 60 days of the campaign being launched, which will land us around early December. And we really think that this shows how the Palestinian fight for liberation is so interconnected to all liberation around the world. And if Palestinians don't have freedom of expression, then that just shows how easily these huge tech giants that are more and more taking control over our lives can control any marginalized group. So there's so much that we could get into, but I'll end it on, I mentioned in the beginning that in the United States, this is kind of happening at the same time that it is much more politically feasible to be pro-Palestinian than it ever has been. For so long, there has been, I loved what Ernesto said, many of the worst ideas are bipartisan. For so long, there has been bipartisan support of the state of Israel, and the United States is a friend of the state of Israel, regardless of what the state of Israel is doing. Well, AIPAC, the largest funder of pro-Israeli candidates, which has been, as I mentioned, bipartisan historically, is more and more being considered associated with the conservative movement. And they spent millions of dollars in this midterm election to really try to defeat pro-Palestinian candidates. And they lost again and again and again. They lost. And a lot of folks are commenting on how many folks that are of the younger generation are starting to register to vote, and that's changing the political landscape. And guess what? The younger generation is pro-Palestinian. And so there has been an era forever of PEP, Progressive Accept Palestine. And we think that era is coming to an end. And we think that a progressive agenda is going to be centered in the Palestinian experience, and that anyone that identifies as a progressive must be pro-Palestinian. And we're really excited to see what that could mean for our advocacy.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much, Eric. And I think it's so important for people to like hear those case studies and understand those impacts, and just like think a little bit more complicatedly about when we say things like we want platforms to remove all violent content, for example, how does that actually get interpreted by risk-averse for-profit platforms that don't have an anti-oppressive power analysis, right? And how do we then, hold these companies accountable and push for them to reduce harm in ways that don't lead to the types of collateral damage that you're describing there. And I think for me, what Fight for the Future has kind of always said in this case is it's not about downplaying the harms or pretending that viral spread of hateful content and disinformation aren't causing real problems, aren't posing a significant threat to the democratic process, aren't leading to disproportionate harms to marginalized communities, but it's to ask ourselves, what are the actual interventions there? And for me, the thing I always come back to is that regulating speech is really, really difficult and tends to disproportionately harm marginalized communities. But we can regulate surveillance. And we have kind of an understanding of how we can regulate the surveillance practices of these for-profit platforms that they use to kind of power some of the types of, for example, algorithmic recommendation systems that we know tend to prioritize crappy content. And so on that vein of kind of what can we do or what the positives are, and noting that we're starting to come up on the end of our session here, I wanted to kick it back to you, Christine, if I can, to talk about privacy specifically as one of the areas where we could see some positive intervention. I think there's open questions about the American Data Privacy and Protection Act, the piece of privacy legislation that still may move forward. But then there's also the Federal Trade Commission, which has started a rulemaking on corporate surveillance practices. Could you talk to us a little bit about that and what the opportunities are for people to make their voices heard, to try to influence that process and lead to some intervention that addresses some of the harms that folks are talking about without leading to the types of harms that Eric just described?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I'll say I've been working on privacy legislation in some capacity since like 2018, and this seems like the most progress we've made, both in Congress and at the FTC. The American Data Privacy Protection Act has been marked up on the House side and voted out in committee, I think 53-2, I want to say, and which is pretty remarkable considering how strong the legislation is, that it's not this weak bipartisan compromise. It's really the best, I think the best, working together that we've seen in Congress on tech legislation, really, as well as antitrust. But yeah, it's really promising, and there's some political complications on the Senate side, but I think people can contact their representatives and say that they care about privacy. But there's also a more direct way to get involved through the FTC, which has begun a rulemaking process for commercial surveillance. So this is a huge gamut of different practices in the private sector that affect just basic data rights, as well as like algorithmic discrimination. It's a whole gamut. I think there's 95 questions, and anyone from the public is able to comment and share their perspective on the harms in their community, and I think give the agency a better understanding of how data practices affect real people, and different perspectives. So if you're interested in that, definitely engage in the FTC process. And I think there has been this narrative that privacy is dead and people don't care about privacy, and we're really seeing that change, and it's really encouraging to me. I think like the different communities here are showing how privacy supports whatever your cause is. Privacy is really essential to that. So I think it's an exciting time for both the legislation and the regulation side.
Awesome. And an exciting time for people who are building tools that protect people's privacy, like Proton. So thanks for that work as well. We had a question in the chat that's related to this, which is around students and teenagers and kids in school, and how to address or deal with the surveillance that young people are facing in our society today. And quickly, I'll just say that One thing is that organizing works. I know at Fight for the Future, we supported students on more than 60 college campuses in pushing back against the use of facial recognition on college campuses. And we got 60 of the most prominent colleges and universities in the world to say that they won't use facial recognition at their events. A lot of that work was led by students with kind of a backing of a national organization like us. And so if there's surveillance going on at your school, if they're using tools like Social Sentinel or Proctorio, and you're worried about it, call me, reach out to Fight for the Future, reach out to EFF. We would love to help you take on your administration and win, and do a very good kind of revenge of the kids time. So, it can be done. And I think at that kind of hyper local level is actually where we're seeing some of the most success. Another big one on that was, and here's where the power of Twitter comes into play. With just a quick few tweets, we managed to get the Trevor Project, which was a prominent LGBT organization, to cut ties with a surveillance software company that was basically trying to use them to launder their surveillance software. The villain there is very much the surveillance software company, not the Trevor Project. But that's an example of where some organizing actually made a difference. So, I guess I'd say don't sit there and take it. Reach out, build community, and we can fight back against this type of surveillance in our lives. We've got 7 minutes left. And we have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 panelists. So you all have exactly 45 seconds, and I'm gonna just call on you, and you're gonna say whatever you want for those 45 seconds. It could literally just be like, bye, follow me on Mastodon at this account, or whatever, or you can just have it be 45 seconds of awkward silence and kind of slowly get closer and closer to your camera, or whatever you want to do. This is your time. And to show you how much time you have, I'm gonna slowly move to the right. And then when I'm off screen, that means that you're done. And then we go to the next person. Okay, this is what we're doing. So Brandon, go.
Ooh, it's a lot of pressure. Move slow for me, Evan. So I think what I want to leave folks with is that, like folks have said here, I think that the fight and the struggle for our liberation is always going to be primarily at the local level. But the other thing I want to share with folks is that regulations and laws and rules and kind of punitive measures are never going to be the thing that's going to create the society we want. So as we're trying to fight all these bad things and get some good things done, we need to remember that there are bigger systems that we're trying to challenge. And so under a racial capitalist system, these platforms, this internet is never going to be safe. And as much as I want to get everybody to connect to the internet, I want to make sure that it's a safe place that they're able to connect to. I'll stop. I think you've reached the limit.
Perfect. Ernesto.
Yeah, I would say I think what's gotten me the most jazzed about the midterm results is just the fact that a lot of people naysayed the administration's effort to, I think, go after what you would traditionally call youth issues, or issues that younger voters care about, and they did in a very forceful way. And now the narrative, I think, is oh, hey, that actually sounds like a good idea, so run with it. The next 2 years for a lot of those issues that are out there but still haven't been tackled, I think the opportunity is huge for kind of the age 30 and down crowd of this country to exert their power. So this is your chance. Go for it.
Mariah.
So if folks want to learn more about SWP, swp.urbanjustice.org, please donate. We're a very underfunded movement and a very underfunded organization. So always want to plug for that. And then also one thing we didn't really talk about is DA races. So there weren't a lot that we were following specifically during this midterms, but in San Francisco and LA, there were new DAs that were elected. So if you live in those areas, unfortunately, those DAs are not nearly as progressive as we would hope. Same with Baltimore City, their state attorney. So overall, the election results from midterms on the DA side is disappointing, but track what your DAs are doing. It's a great point of advocacy at the local level. So I encourage folks to really get engaged with who their local legislators are and the people who hold levers of power that you can use for your benefit.
Awesome. Jenny.
Thanks, Evan. First of all, thanks to Fight for the Future. Always great to work with you guys. Come follow GLAAD, GLAAD, everywhere, including on Mastodon, of course. Apparently we've been on Mastodon since 2018, I just learned. Yeah, I mean, LGBTQ people are under attack on social media, and a lot of what we do is deal with, hate speech and asking the platforms to be better, and as well as fighting for freedom of expression, and that we need to be protected from suppression of our speech as well. Okay, I know you're off screen, Evan, but one last thing. Which is, you talked about kind of regulatory solutions, and I do feel like that is the long game in terms of the industry. And I always like to quote Joan Donovan at the Shorenstein Center at Harvard. She once said something that just gave me so much hope, which is that she said, "I believe we will win." Those are my words, her words. Thank you.
Word. Sawyeh.
I think my parting thought is just to make sure that we celebrate the wins. And I say this to all of the organizers listening in this call, budding organizers, people who generally care. In terms of the midterms, everything in political science said there was going to be a red wave. History told us. The polls were thinking it in the beginning, and there literally wasn't. It was not a red wave. We may lose control of the House by a little bit. There's still a little bit of hope, but we prevented very, very bad, something that would have been very, very bad. And I think it's important to remember that. It's important to keep joy and celebration and congratulate ourselves when we do things that make this world a little less bad. And I know that we talked a lot about a lot of bad things here, but I just want to remind us also that we pulled off something pretty fucking great this week because we voted. So thank you, everyone.
Awesome. In the interim, I should have mentioned this earlier, but obviously folks are here from all over the place. I will note that some of the orgs here are nonpartisan or 501c3s or 501c4s. So all caveats apply. And Kate, did we do you? I forget. No, we didn't. Kate.
Totally seconding the celebrate the wins. And I think the thing that I really want to implore is there's a lot of fights right now. Please don't forget about the conversations that are happening on criminalization. And I say that for two reasons. First, because we keep talking about the First Amendment, but if you criminalize behavior, speech on that behavior doesn't fall into the First Amendment. And it's pretty fucking easy to do in this country to criminalize things. Second, we're having the same conversations. Every time I enter spaces about criminalization, about mass incarceration, it's conversations about redefining public safety, that privacy and safety are not in tension with each other, that the people getting kicked off platforms are the ones experiencing harm, are the marginalized communities. And the fact that these conversations seem to be happening apart from each other, I think does such a disservice. Our liberation is going to be collective. Our liberation is going to be intersectional. And so the more that we can actually realize that we're having the same conversations, whether it's about cops in Baltimore City or whether it's about cops on platforms removing abortion information, they're the same conversations. And the sooner we join them together, the more people we have, the more voices we have, the more energy we have, the more resources, the more capacity, and the more change we can make.
Sign me up for your church. I'm there. Christine.
All right, think that competition is one of, if not the best ways to get privacy to more people and security to more people. And these are deeply interconnected issues. And just use encrypted tools. If you're still using, the big tech, it's hard to avoid, but you never know when you're going to be the subject of surveillance, and it's just good to use encryption. And Proton basic services are free, so proton.me.
Cool. Thanks, Christine. Did I miss anyone in this final wrap up? Oh, Eric. Oh my gosh. Eric, please.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks, Evan. I would just say that I would love to remind everyone that the fights in the United States and how you shape your advocacy in the United States has extremely global implications, and things that are oftentimes framed as objectively good, like taking down violent content, is extremely politicized. So we know President Zelensky in Ukraine has called to take up arms against Russian invaders, and the way the Western world has treated Ukrainian content is very much different than the way the Western world treats Palestinian content. And we are supportive of Ukrainians' right to self-defense. And we just want Palestinians to be able to experience that same right to self-defense and to have it be framed in a similar way. But we know that when Ukrainians are labeled as heroes, Palestinians are labeled as terrorists. And this is all coming from a politicized world that we live in that is very US-centric. So whenever you're shaping your campaigns and your advocacy, think about the global implications, and from Hamle's perspective, certainly think about how this could impact the Palestinian perspective and experience. So thanks so much to Fight for the Future for inviting and for organizing this great event.
Awesome. I forgot to slide off screen because you all were captivating me, but thank you all so much for being here. We're only 3 minutes over, which I think is impressive given the number of topics that we just kind of plowed through, and obviously still many stones left unturned and more conversations to be had. But I'm really proud of just like this group of people, and I love working with all of you on all of these issues in the various ways that our work intersects. And thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and knowledge. And thanks to the folks that showed up to watch. We will post a recording of this on social and wherever and share it out with the panelists as well. And yeah, the fight continues. These decisions that we are making as a society about technology and the policies that govern it, I think we really are in a watershed moment where the battles that we're having over the next couple of years may define the entire future of humanity, and certainly will define what my child and many of your children and our children's children future looks like. So I thank you all for doing the work to try to shape that and make it slightly less shitty, or maybe even good or better. I know we'll have many more conversations to come. So thank you all very much. And thanks to Anna, who is behind the Fight for the Future avatar there, doing all the behind the scenes work and did a lot of work pulling this together. And thanks to the whole Fight for the Future team and all of you for being here. Lots of love. Take care, y'all.
Thanks, everyone.